All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate you taking the time out of the day to come listen to me talk. I'm going to be presenting my paper that I recently got published in Urban Studies with my co-author, Christopher Robeson. He's actually out at Northern Illinois University, and I met him as a graduate student at Ohio State. And so we had the same advisor, and we hooked up several years later once we realized we had interests that overlapped. And this is the first paper that we've published together. We're still working on some others, but this is the first one that we're publishing. So what I'm going to present to you today is the paper that Chris and I recently published. The full title is Forced Urbanization, a cross-national assessment of the effects of international political violence on a nation's largest cities. And I'm going to get into an overview. I won't get too technical until the end. I'm going to make it very accessible for everyone. Even though there is some stats involved, and I will talk about it a little bit, I'll do the interpretation for you so everyone can understand it. If you are interested in the statistics, I do have an overview of the results at the end that I can certainly show to anyone if you have questions, and that should not be a problem. So here's our research question. What effect does international political violence have on urbanization in the developing world? It is a very broad question, but it's a very important question because prior to this, no one had ever addressed this question. In fact, we had to begin our research using our own approach. And what we did is we began by reviewing the research on forced migration. And this was the topic that was probably the closest to what we were interested in studying. And as we made our way through the literature, we quickly discovered that studies on internally displaced peoples, or what we call IDPs, probably contain the most relevant information. So the forcibly displaced can be refugees, people who move from one nation to another, but they can also be internally displaced, people who are displaced within the actual nation. And again, the research on the internally displaced was the most relevant for us. So after coming to this conclusion, we also realized that we had to think a lot deeper about the effects of political violence on urbanization. And in doing so, we concluded that from a theoretical and a methodological perspective, focusing on intranational political violence made the most sense. So violence within the nation that can be rooted in political causes, not between nations. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't believe that international violence, political violence, has no effect on urbanization. It probably does, but it was not going to be the focus of our research. So once we settled on limiting our analysis to international political violence and the internally displaced people, we were left with three topics that we needed to address in greater detail. First, we had to think about what effect political violence had on rural to urban migration and also urban to urban migration. And so, in other words, we really needed a migration theory that took political violence into account. Second, we need to think about where people go when they are faced with the threat of violence. A lot of times people do go to camps, refugee camps that you'll see. And I'm actually going to show you that here in a little bit. But that's not always where they go. Only a small portion of people actually go there from what we learned reading the case studies. And then finally, we had to think about whether or not different forms of political violence have the same or different effect on migratory patterns. And that was a very important question. You're going to see it's going to be central to our methodological insights. So I'm going to examine each of these questions one at a time, but first I do want to discuss the concept of forced migration in a little bit more detail so that I can provide everyone with the foundation that's needed to really follow along and understand our argument. Okay, so a good general definition of forced migration is the permanent or temporary migration of people away from their homes, region, or native lands due to life-threatening or potentially life-threatening circumstances caused by natural disasters or human-made disasters. And obviously, we're going to focus on the human-made disasters. So the forced migration, it does include both refugees and the internally displaced, just like I told you, but we again focused on the IDPs. One thing I do want to mention, though, real quickly, is that the concept of forced migration obviously does include those who are displaced by natural disasters, and these are important forms of displacement that could have an effect on urbanization, but we actually do not address this in our research. We did control for it statistically in our models, and to be honest with you, the models we had, whether we included or excluded the natural disasters, had no bearing on our results, so we just left it out for simplification. All right, so actually let's look at a map here. This map is just for 1 year, and this shows you every region in the world where internally displaced people reside. And of course, the darker the nation, the more internal displacement there is. This is just for 1 year. My friend and I actually made a GIF. We couldn't put it on here, but we made a GIF, and we kind of show over time, I think it was a 10-year period, 2003 to 2015, of all the places, and you just see that internal displacement caused by political violence, this is just by political violence, is global. It is definitely global, and it's a really important issue. So really thinking about all this displacement going on, we need to know, where are people going to? How is it affecting where people live and how they survive? And that's really what drove our question. And here's kind of a second graph here. This bar chart really shows you that internal displacement caused by political violence has fluctuated, but overall it's definitely increased over time. And we're going to see one of the hotbeds of political violence here causing displacement in a short while. All right, so going along with these graphs, I want to show you a video clip from the BBC News, and I hope that this is going to work. This was released just last summer, and this video captures the ongoing forced migration of the Rohingya people in southeast Myanmar. Now, the Rohingya are a Muslim minority ethnic group. They are not recognized as citizens by the Myanmar government, and in fact, they are classified as illegal immigrants, even though they've actually resided in this area for over 1,000 years. So since the Myanmar government has gained its independence from Great Britain in 1948, this group has been repeatedly involved in episodes of political violence with the nation's religious Buddhist majority. Now, in recent decades, the Rohingya have been forcibly displaced from their villages in southwest Myanmar, and the clip that I'm going to show you is from last summer. But there were news reports this past summer that had the exact same thing. And so what happened is that there were a whole bunch of villages that were literally burned to the ground because people came in and burned them. The Myanmar government claims that the Rohingya burned their own villages to try and blame it on the Myanmar government. And so these people have been basically forced out of their villages where they've resided for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in this clip, you're going to see they're on their way to Bangladesh. Now, the problem is that in Bangladesh, the government isn't consistent in when or who they let in. So these people, when they can't make it to Bangladesh, to the camps, which you'll see, they are internally displaced. They actually have to go somewhere else in Myanmar. And so really the main point of showing you this clip then is to give you an idea of a real-world example where people are affected by political violence and to understand what people in the developing world are facing. Because even though this is in Myanmar, it's in the East, this occurs in Africa, it occurs in the Middle East, it occurs all around the globe. And so let's actually see, hopefully this clip will work. It's only like maybe 3 minutes long or something like that. If it won't work, maybe I'll have to load it to the desktop if it's not going to. Here, let's see if I can find it. It's not going to work. Sorry about this. I thought maybe it would work. I think I got it from YouTube. The other thing I can try and do is, I did not put it on here. Nope. All right, well, maybe it's not going to work for me. Let's try it again. We'll try one last time. No, it's not going to work. Okay, so basically what this shows is it shows a whole village that has been displaced. And maybe if I skip through the video, we can see different pictures. But what happens is I want to show you the refugee camp if I can find it on here, which I may not be able to. It's more towards the end. But basically, the people have they all of a sudden overnight I think 6 of their men had been killed in the village. And so this is just out of the blue. And so these people that they were actually following were walking through this river, which was a low-lying valley because they had to get away from the jungles. It was the easiest path. And they were walking through the valley trying to get across to Bangladesh. And basically it happened overnight. The people got killed. Everyone got scared for their lives. And they took off to this refugee camp that they heard about. And that's where they were lucky to get into it. But for some people, the violence occurs and they can't make it into Bangladesh because the Bangladesh army stops them from coming in. All right, so let's see if I can get out of this. There we go. So now that we have a good understanding of what forced migration is, I do want to explore the other questions that I brought up earlier. And I want to start with a question about the effect of political violence on rural to urban migration patterns. This does require looking at the classic or standard economic model that had been applied to the developing region world since the 1970s. And a primary issue that scholars had in the 1960s was trying to explain this phenomenon called over-urbanization. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept of over-urbanization, it refers to a situation where a nation's rate of urban growth exceeds its rate of industrial or economic development. So in other words, more people are moving from the country to the city than there are jobs available. And this picture of Nairobi, Kenya, gives you a really good example. If you look here, this is the central business district. This is where all the people who have jobs are. There's actually a wall. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's a wall. And after that wall, this is Shantytown. These are all people who do not have jobs. They are part of the informal economy. They're not part of the formal economy. They don't have electricity. They don't have sewers, but they all go there. And so people want to know, how could a human being want to go live here? Why would all these people move here? And the economists, Michael Tordero and John Harris, were the first to come up with an explanation for why this phenomenon occurred, because it just isn't Nairobi. It was all over the developing world where this was happening. So I want to go over their statement, because this is a good example from their model to understand, or a good quote from their paper to understand. They say this. They say the crucial assumption to be made about our model is that the rural to urban migration will continue so long as the expected urban real income at the margin exceeds real agricultural product. That is, prospective rural migrants behave as maximizers of expected utility. So what they're saying is the reason why all those people moved to that area is because they were moving based off of the expectation that they could become part of the formal economy. So they were acting very rational. They weren't acting irrational like some other people had assumed and suggested. So although this model does help explain some aspects of rapid urbanization in the developing world, it rests on an untested assumption, and that it's this. They are assuming that development in the developing world is occurring in politically stable climates. Now, anyone who's studied democratization or global political history knows that since colonial times, political stability has been anything but stable in the developing world. Not only have colonial powers purposefully created political instabilities in many regions, they have profited from it in post-colonial times. So in fact, most nations experiencing rapid urbanization are probably the least politically stable nations in the world. And they often have major episodes of political violence that just don't occur over long periods of time, but short cyclical periods of times. So the instability is really, really there. So given this, we search for an alternative rural to urban migration theory to inform our research, because this model, even though it does help explain some behavior, didn't provide the foundation that we actually needed. So luckily, in our research, we came across Andrew Morrison's article, and it was based on his research in Guatemala and Colombia. And so what he took from this is that Morrison doesn't completely reject the classical model, and he doesn't really reject the premise that people seek to maximize the utility of their migration movements. He agrees with that. But he does reject the notion that the primary basis for migration will always be economic in nature, which is what the Harris-Todaro model basically argued. And this is because monetary gain is not the only thing that you can get from a migration movement. There's other things to be gained, and they need to be taken into consideration. So to fix the classic model, Morrison points to a basic truth about humans. Most people fear death, and in general, people do not want to die, and they will take steps to avoid dying. So given this, there are conditions under which the decision to migrate is literally a matter of life and death. So even if people expect migration will lower their economic earnings, if the migration is expected to preserve their life or the life of their family and their loved ones, then they will move without regard for economic gain. For this reason, Morrison correctly identified that people in conflict-ridden regions of the world often use migration as a strategy to produce safety. And this is even if safety is just a perception, just like the economic gain is a perception. So what Morrison ends up proposing is that rural-to-urban migration, especially in the context of political violence, will be based on migratory actions that maximize perceived safety. People will move out in an area that is perceived, or they will move into an area that is perceived to be the safest, and they will move out of areas that they perceive to be dangerous. So if the threat of political violence is perceived to be life-threatening, most people will move. And you will actually find in case studies that not all people move. Some people will refuse to leave their homeland. They will just not move no matter how bad the violence gets. So what we did is we concluded then, using Morrison's logic, that cities should be the safest places for the rural displaced to move to. All right. So similar to urban ward migration, when people perceived the violence to be life-threatening, we found that, again, in the case studies, most but not all people did develop migration strategies that involved movement to large cities. And that's kind of where we started to get the idea from. Another theme that emerged when we read the case studies and the interviews was that most rural IDPs believed that their movement was temporary. Again, they didn't want to leave their homelands. They didn't want to leave behind their villages, their lands, where they grew up. So they always believed that their movement was temporary. The problem is when the violence continued or it was cyclical, those moves forced them to become, the move, I guess, was forced to become permanent. And that's really where the concept of forced urbanization came about. Because these people are rural people, and they're proud of being rural people. They don't want to be urban, but because the violence affects their areas, they're forced to become urban and to adapt to urban areas. So again, as a whole, the case studies really did reveal that this pattern, and this is what we looked at too. So we started to think about what makes cities a preferred place to move. Why would they be perceived as safe places? And we actually came up with a pretty good list here. So the first thing that we realized is that a lot of people who are forcibly displaced, like the Rohingya, they're minority groups. And so minority group out in the wilderness, they're the only group there. It's easy to target them. But when you move into a large city where there's a lot of other minority groups and diversity, you get anonymity. And so cities provide anonymity to minority groups. It does also lower the likelihood that you will be targeted. So if you go to, if you're in a city of 1,000 people, the chance that you're targeted by political violence is pretty high. If you're in a city of 10 million people, the chances of you being targeted are very low because there's so many other places to target. The other thing, obviously, is that cities provide access to modern infrastructure and technology. And so it can ease the burden of a hard migration, of a forced migration. The other important thing is that at very large cities, that's where the headquarters of national government organizations are and other aid organizations. That's where they distribute their aid from because it comes from the developed world to the developing world. And so by moving to a very large city, you're more likely to get some sort of aid to help you through that period. And then, of course, the other thing is the perceived economic opportunities. It's not that the economic opportunities that urban areas offer are bad. They're just not the first consideration, but they are certainly there. And so even if a migrant doesn't have any skills that translates into some sort of formal economic participation, they can still participate in the informal economy. And that's easier to do when there's a lot of people around. And as you can saw from in Nairobi, the informal economy is actually pretty big. So there are opportunities there. And then the last one, very, very important. If a nation is in political conflict internally, chances are the largest cities are going to be defended by the political elite, because that's where their technologies are, that's where their money is, that's where their connection to the outside world is. And so the elites will have armies, they will have forces that defend that space, that place, which is very, very important. So the displaced can go there and get that protection. All right, so the next question we had to address was, and this is the final question, whether or not different kinds of intranational political violence were associated with rural or urban environments. In other words, is a given type of political violence more likely to occur in one setting than another setting? And this is very, very important, as you're going to see for the methods. And so given our expertise in political change, we had good ideas about the kind of political violence that would be associated with which type of environment, and so we use this to come up with what we called spatial logics. So first I want to go over is terrorism. And my colleague Chris Robeson is an expert in terrorism, and so he provided a lot of these insights for here. I'll give him a lot of credit for that. So broadly speaking, terrorism is a form of political violence in which civilians in known public spaces are targeted to create the most harm with the least amount of effort. The goal of terrorism is to make symbolic statements using the fear of death as a spectacle. It is not meant to win land resources or elicit political change. Terrorism is largely a symbolic act, which makes it a unique form of political violence. Because terrorists seek to maximize casualties and attack known targets to create political theater, which does require media attention, urban areas with known spaces and high population density are more likely to be targeted. This does not mean that terrorism never occurs in small villages or rural areas. It just means that it's more effective in its goal when it's carried out in urban areas, and thus urban spaces are more valuable targets for terrorists. And so therefore, we conclude that the spatial logic of terrorism is urban. Now, guerrilla insurgencies is a different type of political violence, internal political violence. It's much longer lasting, and it's a kind of political violence that involves armed combatants who want to seize and control land. They actually do want to hold on to land. And this type of warfare usually involves a resource-rich political elite who control the major cities, and a resource-poor group of dissidents who reside in rural strongholds, and again, they want to protect that area. So in fact, guerrilla insurgents prefer rural areas because the natural environment offers them resources that can be used for offensive and defensive support. For instance, the harsh terrain of mountains or dense jungles make it harder for elites to attack, but it's easier for dissidents to defend. At the same time, insurgents can easily bully rural people and who are unprotected and usurp their resources and their children and their people, which they do. They can forcibly recruit the men in the villages to become part of their army. If you've ever seen the Netflix film Beast of No Nation, that's exactly what that film is about. So for this reason, we conclude that the spatial logic of guerrilla insurgency is rural in nature. Again, this doesn't mean that there's no urban forms of guerrilla warfare. There are. It's just more likely to be in rural areas. And then finally, civil war, the last major form of intranational political violence that we take on. It's a kind of political violence in which two evenly matched or closely evenly matched oppositional forces are at war over the control of an entire nation or at least a major part of a nation. Faroon and Leighton, they had a seminal article on civil war which argues that most civil wars emerge from guerrilla insurgencies. And so that is, if when insurgents become more evenly matched in terms of their resources and their support, civil wars tend to erupt. And so in these instances, insurgents are likely to gain control of more of a nation's land, and with it at least one major city. So when civil wars break out, both sides are likely to establish a military presence in rural and urban environments, so both environments technically will be attacked and defended. So this means that those who are threatened by the political violence should be determined by the intensity of the fighting. So in other words, where the attacks are occurring should be directly related to how intense the battle is between these two forces. And so we argue basically that the spatial logic of civil wars should be related to how intense the fighting becomes over time. Less intensity means rule. More intensity means it moves to cities and it becomes urban. All right, so ideally, when it comes to the data on political violence, all attacks would be geospatially located. We would know exact coordinates of where an attack occurred. Now, this does occur for some databases for certain years. But again, we wanted to have a cross-national longitudinal study that created or looked at as many years as possible. What we found with the attack data that had coordinates is that even though they had coordinates, those coordinates could not easily be translated into rural or urban locations. So, luckily, we found this other database, the Global Terrorism Database, and we found out that it groups attacks and casualties for terrorism and guerrilla insurgency, and the MEPV data has very similar data for civil wars, and that is the major episodes of political violence data set. All right, so I'm going to show you the coding rules that we actually used to take. We took our spatial logics that I just went over, terrorism being an urban form of political violence, guerrilla insurgency being a rural form of political violence, and then civil war having a more of a urban/rural depending on the intensity. Now, we took those measures and we actually coded the attacks and the casualties in the GTD database. And this is what we came up with. So, as you can see here, an attack was coded as terrorism and thus assumed to be urban if the target was civilian in nature. And those targets include, I'll give you some examples, civilians, churches, schools, businesses, transportation, public transportation. An attack was coded as guerrilla and thus assumed to be rural if the target was against the government. And this included government property, government personnel, officials. I believe we even included assassinations. And then basically what this means is that we equated attacks on civilians and urban-based terrorism and attacks against government with the rural-based insurgency. We did do the same thing for the MEPV data, but it had a little bit of a different coding scheme, which is technicality, which I'm probably not going to get into, but if you have questions about it, I'll certainly go over it. All right, so for our measures of the attacks, the one thing that we had to take in mind is that people, as we talked about from Morrison's perspective, people will not flee political violence unless the threat is perceived to be real. So we had to have a way to capture perception. And what we did is we used attacks and casualties as a measure of intensity. That is, we assumed that the more casualties per attack there are in a given area, the more perception there is going to be that there's a need to move. They need to produce safety. And so that's kind of what I'm showing you right here. And we did the exact same thing with the Civil War measure. And luckily, the Civil War measure already has an intensity measure in it. So we created a running count of how long the Civil War had been going on, and we multiplied that by every year intensity. So we created equivalent measures across the board, basically, so that we could test our hypotheses. One thing I also want to point out before I move on with the dependent variable and get into the hypotheses is that we did create 5-year running averages of all these measures. And the reason we do that is that you can't just look at a snapshot of a year because, as I talked about, people believe that their movement to cities is temporary. They want to move back. So there might be a lot of people who move into a city one year, then move back, but then they move back to the city. And then, so in order for the forced urbanization to become permanent, it may take 3, 4, 5 years. So we assume that with the 5-year running average, we would capture that cyclical nature of forced urbanization. All right, so here's a visualization of our coding rules. This is kind of a basic dummy variable. Let's talk about the dependent variable. Dependent variable is just a measure of city growth. This comes from a database that I collected for my dissertation, where I collected historical population figures for every city, the 5 largest cities for every nation from 1955 to 2010. And it took a lot of looking in the books and on websites and cross-checking, and it took a lot of time. So anyway, it's my urban primacy data set. So we use that to calculate city growth. All right, so let's get to the hypotheses. And I kind of put my hypotheses in a picture so you could see what I'm talking about. The first one is pretty straightforward. There are curvilinear hypotheses, a little more complicated. I'll talk about them some, but I'm going to present to you just the linear versions of the hypotheses. So the first one is this: the more lethal the attacks against civilian targets, so urban-based forms of political violence, the slower the population growth in the largest city. So you got your attacks occurring in the cities. This is going to push people to either move to smaller cities that they perceive to be more safe, or move out into the rural areas if there are no other cities to go to. And we account for both in our models. We certainly do. So that's the first one. The second one, the more lethal the attacks against government targets, the greater the population growth in a city. So the idea is that as guerrilla insurgencies are occurring in rural areas, people in rural areas perceive their safety to be very life-threatening, like the Rohingya people that we saw, and they will seek safety in a city. And this is the real true form of the forced urbanization. And the last one is a time-dependent process, since we're talking about the intensity of civil war. So early on, when civil wars have low intensity, we assume that a lot of the attacks will occur outside of the city. And then as it becomes more intense, and this, again, is just the linear version, it'll force people into cities. The curvilinear one's kind of, I would need more than 2 time periods to demonstrate to you. But it's the one that we actually end up finding support for. So I do want to talk about my method of investigation. This is where people can take a brief nap, I suppose. So our primary method of investigation was a series of longitudinal regressions that included 85 developing nations for the years 1974 to 2005. And since we had a very large sample of nations and time periods, we had to include what are called panel-corrected standard errors. Now, based on the work of Beck and Katz, this procedure has been demonstrated to use standard errors that produce coefficient estimates that are more reliable, and they do compensate for contemporaneous correlation. However, the panel-corrected standard errors do not account for autocorrelation, which is correlation over time. And so that's something that cannot be ignored in a time series analysis that is trying to look at change over time. And so the basic problem of autocorrelation is that the errors of the regressors can be correlated over time, which can basically result in coefficients that appear to be significant when they are not, because it's really the correlations that's providing the significance. And so the standard procedure in these cases is to use a lag-dependent variable. So you would take city growth from last year or 5 years ago, whatever it is, and you put it in your model, and that's supposed to eliminate the correlation because you're using the city size from the growth from last several years to predict the future years. It's supposed to nullify it. Now, there is a test for autocorrelation, and it's a chi-square test, and what we actually ended up finding is that because we had these 5-year averages, we used them, there was no autocorrelation in our models. So we did not have to include a lag-dependent variable, but it's very important to mention that. And then finally, it's important to mention that we did include these things called country fixed effects. And basically, when you have a time series regression, you're trying to predict change over time. You cannot include multiple time invariant measures in your models because they will all act like competing dummy variables. So you can only have one time invariant measure model, and that's what the fixed effect does. It is a placeholder for that nation or for that country that's supposed to take into account all the different unique properties of the nation, like how many lakes it may have, how big the nation size in terms of area, things that don't change over time. So those were included in our models, and they're very, very important. It's a very, very standard procedure to do, because otherwise, again, you may in this case, you may find things that are not significant that are, or find things that are significant that are not. So it can actually go both ways. So let's actually get into the results. So now in full disclosure, I do want everyone to know that the variables in our models are all logged to correct for skewness, which is, again, very standard. But it makes interpreting the actual numbers very difficult because you start to interpret things in logged units and interacted log units, which doesn't really make a lot of real-world sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to present to you the results in plain language. We're going to skip the numbers and skip the log interpretations, and I'll just tell you what we basically find. So for the first hypothesis, which states the more lethal the attacks against civilians, the slower the population growth in a larger city, we did not find support for a linear effect, but we found strong support for a curvilinear effect. So at low levels of civilian attack intensity, growth in the largest city is not deterred by political violence, which is what the first part of that curve shows you. There's still growth. However, at moderate increase in level of civilian attack intensity, growth in the largest city, the nation's largest city, slows considerably, and at very high levels of attack intensity, it actually decreases. So the population size in the largest city decreases. All right, the second hypothesis, which stated the more lethal the attacks against government, the greater the population growth in the largest city, we found very strong support for the linear model. And so there is evidence that political violence associated with guerrilla insurgency affects the population growth of a nation's largest city. And the effect was also strongly supported in our models with secondary city growth as a dependent variable. So we ran other models that had a collection of secondary city growth because the argument was if one thing bad is, or good is happening for the largest city, then we should see the reverse effect in the secondary cities, and that's exactly what we see here. So we found two forms of empirical support. So the effect was also strongly supported in the models with secondary city growth, and so the collection of regression models together do provide strong evidence for the phenomena of forced urbanization. It is something that really is occurring and has been occurring since the 1970s and probably before if we had data on it. And it probably does, and we didn't really address this in our paper, but it probably does tie into a lot of the over-urbanization that we see. So over-urbanization is probably not just purely economic driven through perception. All right, so the last result here. For the third hypothesis, there was no support for the linear effect, but there was support for a curvilinear effect. The shorter and less intense the Civil War, the greater the growth in the nation's largest city. However, as the intensity and duration increase, the rate of growth slows considerably, and at the highest levels of intensity, civil wars have a negative effect on the growth of a nation's largest city. And moreover, the effect of civil war intensity on secondary city growth had the exact opposite curvilinear effect. It actually went like this. So in other words, at very high levels of intensity for civil wars, secondary cities grew very rapidly. So people were moving out of the nation's capital probably that was being targeted. They didn't want to give up their urban living. They would move to another large city. All right, so to conclude, I'm going to quickly point out the implications of our study. First, our results provide strong evidence that there is need for cross-national scholars of urban development to think about the implications of the effects of political instability has on urbanization. The effects of political instability on urbanization, urban development has not been taken on. The phenomenon of forced urbanization is definitely real, and it provides evidence that there's probably a link to over-urbanization and other urban issues that are plaguing the developing world. And second, researchers who collect data on displaced people should probably make more of an effort to identify where the displaced are relocating to. If we would have had that information, it would have made the analysis much, much easier, but also more exact and with greater confidence. And then finally, urban planners, governments, and those who provide aid to displaced should use these findings to think strategically about how support and aid should be used to meet the challenges of the nations facing political instability. Knowing where and who to help and when means that more people will be helped and less resources would essentially be wasted. And that's what we have. I'm done. So I guess we will take questions, and we're supposed to maybe use the microphone. if people have questions, I guess maybe I can grab this thing and see if it's on. Turn it on. Ah, there we go. Questions, questions, questions. We got a question. Oh, yeah.
Let's use the shanty town. Okay, certainly.
Ah.
No problem.
Audio, video people.
Thank you.
Yes.
Using the example of the shanty town outside of Nairobi, which you indicated has a wall separating the shanty town from the urban center, did you come across any information that suggested that the people living in the shanty town, although probably motivated to move there by economic expectations or political violence, have they been integrated into the Kenyan political process, which is very contentious between the two main parties there, perhaps three?
Okay, that's actually a really good question, because the answer that we don't have any evidence for, but some case studies suggest that yes, as people move into those regions, into those urban areas, over time they do gain greater political participation, at least in some way, because the governments can't continue to ignore them, and in some cases they do bond together. It is possible. I don't know that it occurs all the time, because a lot of those people are very poverty stricken, and it kind of goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If your basic living needs aren't met, you're not going to be thinking about political rights or you know what I'm saying. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't cases, because the things I can think of is I've been working on a paper looking at how forced migration, because what you find is a lot of times it's women and children who are forced to migrate. The men are stuck behind or they're killed. And so looking at, does forced migration actually increase women's rights over time? Because as they move in and become part of the formal economy through the introduction of the informal economy, does that then give them more political rights? Now, the reason I came up with that idea is because if you look in Africa, like in Zimbabwe, for the longest time, women were not allowed in cities without the aid or the accompanying of a man. And so over time, that has actually changed. And they're one of the areas that for a long time did have political infighting, and may have experienced it. So that's actually a really good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the excellent talk. I find myself wondering about whether the models apply to the United States and the growth of cities in the U.S. And you didn't study that, so sorry to ask you about what you didn't study, but you did say the preceding model had a built-in assumption of stability. Does your model have an assumption of rural, that you're only talking about the developing world? Would this model work in the developed world?
Well, since you'd have to identify something that has a fear of death. So if there's a natural disaster or a human-caused disaster, like a nuclear disaster, like we saw in Japan, then it probably would work. Yes, I would think that all migratory decisions, if there's a component in which a people or group's life is threatened, that will tie into their migratory decisions, which goes back to Morrison, right? That's kind of what he got from studying Colombia and Guatemala, was really understanding that migration is more, it can be more than just about economics. And for the longest time, people just assumed that it was just about economics. And so could it be applied to the United States? I guess in some ways it could be, if there was an event or something that people perceived was life-threatening. So did you have something in mind that you might?
The migration of African Americans out of the South and into the cities of the North.
Well, that was more based off of economic pull factors, probably. At least according to the histories that I've read, is more economic pull factors. So the opportunities for having jobs were essentially there. But I can see what you're saying in terms of being life-threatening. Yeah, I'd have to actually look at data to have an informed conclusion about that. But at the time, industrialization was not at the level that it is now. So it's kind of hard to make the equivalent. Because urbanization was not what it was back then. The largest city was probably New York, and it probably had like over 1 million people, but now it's way more than that. So, but I see what you're saying. Does this apply to more areas? And I think maybe Morrison's basic argument would. I'll say that. Over here, I think Sam has Dr. Green has a question.
Thank you. A very, very fascinating presentation. A lot of these questions will do better after I've had a chance to really read the paper. But I think the previous question speaks a little bit to some of the challenges of disentangling the economic and the fear of violence, because there's often something that's linked. One thing that I didn't see you talk about that might potentially be support for your thesis is so-called private violence. So, for example, gang violence, particularly in the Central American cases I'm very familiar with, which we often think about gang activity as something that is urban, but particularly in Central America, we often see greater rates of gang violence in rural areas. So that might be something in a future iteration to look at. Although at the same time, some people who I've talked to who are Central American migrants here have said part of their choice for to become a migrant rather than seek an alternative in the country is that they feel the violence will be present in both places. But my question, I'm wondering if you're controlling for countries in where there are neither types of violence, but yet you still see significant migration. Because I'm thinking of examples in Latin America. Say Panama is a relatively safe country, but is experiencing also really high levels of urban growth. So I'm wondering if you've controlled for that in the paper.
Yeah, the one issue that you have to keep in mind with cross-national research, especially when you talk about longitudinal research over 30 years, is there sufficient data for every nation, for every data point, for whatever variable you want to talk about? And the answer is no, there's not. And so we cobbled together this. We had to do some methodological, I guess, what would it call some methodological shuffling around to be able to just approximate what we wanted to approximate. And those types of measures actually do not exist. But I think what you're getting at would be very good for case study research, because that's a word instance where there's probably less of that globally, cross-nationally, but it may actually be specific to a few countries. And I would think that, again, given Morrison's assessment that, people believe that the gang activity is too life-threatening, that this is going to affect their children or affect their family, that they may choose to move away from that area. So I think that's probably pretty good insight. But I would say that it has to be probably case study research for that to unravel the truth there. Because cross-nationally, I don't think with the data that I'm aware of, it could ever be done.
Just to get involved a little bit in the study of gang activity, in my research on gang activity, one thing that I've seen is that the involvement in the gang empowers some groups who've been marginalized. So, when you're talking about a certain type of violence that exists, you also have to understand what that violence does in terms of how people see themselves in a particular space and what they feel like being heard. Because sometimes an act of violence against you or, that you actually enact yourself can help you feel like you're a part of a process, whether it's positive or negative. So it would be interesting to study, but there are just a lot of hidden variables there in terms of certain types of violence.
But in some ways we do study exactly what you're saying, because guerrilla warfare is exactly that. A lot of times the guerrillas, the rural people, they are fighting for a cause. They're fighting for a political cause, and they do recruit people who are rural people who feel disenfranchised, that the government has ignored them, and they become part of the guerrilla insurgency, which then can turn into a civil war. So indirectly, we kind of are addressing that, but you're right. That would be how a guerrilla insurgency could certainly turn into a civil war. So yes, there's definitely that element going on here.
Hi, thank you. In terms of a case study, I noted in Cali, and there might be data on this already because it's a historically given. In Cali, Colombia, I noticed that there are a shanty town very similar to what you're seeing in Nairobi. There's not a wall separating it, but it's a straight line. And there's evidence that that was formed when the guerrilla was active, guerrilla living in the rural areas. I don't know if you know that's the case, but the morphology of the city and the shanty town was really striking. And the shanty town's the only part of the city I've not seen because nobody would take me into the shanty town. So I don't know if that's a case that something is known
actually,
about.
It's interesting that you brought that up because I started to look into using satellite imagery to look at areas that had been affected by war. And specifically, I looked at Khartoum in Sudan. And you could see kind of like what you're talking about. I looked at images from the 1970s to the 1980s to the 1990s to the 2000s, and you can actually see the buildup of these shanty towns on the outskirts of Khartoum, exactly like you're talking about. So there's definitely, like I said, the forced urbanization phenomena has to be tied into over-urbanization and to urban poverty and to the emergence of informal economies. It really does have to be. From some respect, I don't think that's all of it. There still are urban pull factors and other urban push factors that are going on. But you're right, places like Colombia, there's a lot of literature on forced migration that I read about Colombia. I mean, that was one of the hotbeds. Colombia, Guatemala, Angola, DRC, places like that. Even in India.
A future work question.
Yes.
So you have 3 different independent variables predicting the same outcome. Are you going to look at their interaction?
We did try to look at some of the interactions, and none of them worked. But the reason for that might be because of how they are measured. So the Civil War measures are not the same scale as the guerrilla insurgency in the terrorist measure. And remember, these aren't measures of terrorism or guerrilla insurgency. They're attacks and casualties. We're making inferences that they are terrorism and that they are guerrilla insurgency. And so that, along with the fact that we created interactions for the intensity attack already, and we logged it, and then created a 5-year running average, that right there, there's so much going on already that having an interaction come up would have been very surprising. But to find curvilinear effects within the same variable, that we absolutely did find, and we did model. So I know what you're saying. If we had more clear, clean data, I think it might be possible. But with the data we had, I don't think that is possible. Other questions? Yeah, well, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. If anybody's interested, the paper was just published in Urban Studies. I'm sure you could probably get it through the library. I think through JSTOR. It's probably their digital copy. It's in the September